The lifelong hatred between Jacqueline Kennedy and her sister Lee wasn't a normal sibling rivalry. It was a strategy. The mastermind behind it was their mother, Janet Norton Lee. Janet didn't raise daughters. She trained assets. She viewed love as a weakness and marriage as a ruthless financial contract. The media called her a social climber, but the truth is much darker. She systematically broke her own children's minds to secure ultimate power and wealth for herself. What kind of mother intentionally turns her daughters into weapons to conquer the American elite? Janet Norton Lee was born on December 3, 1907, in Manhattan. On paper, her life was a portrait of American privilege. Her father, James T. Lee, was a real estate titan. He did not just participate in the New York property market, he shaped it. He was the mastermind behind 998 Fifth Avenue, a legendary luxury building designed to convince the city's ultra-rich to abandon their standalone mansions for upscale apartments. He understood money, structure, and power, but James T. Lee lacked the one currency that mattered most in early 20th century New York: pedigree. Both he and his wife, Margaret Merritt, were the children of Irish Catholic immigrants. In the 1910s, the East Coast establishment operated as a closed fortress. The gatekeepers were the old money Anglo-Saxon Protestant families who traced their lineage back to the Mayflower. They dictated who belonged and who did not. In their eyes, the Irish were laborers, policemen, and domestic servants. Wealth could buy James T. Lee bespoke suits and prime real estate, but it could not buy him an invitation to the elite social clubs, nor could it secure his family a place in the social register. Janet grew up watching this invisible barrier operate. She absorbed the subtle humiliations her family faced. She realized early on that her father's millions were viewed as new money, crude, unrefined, and ultimately inferior. She did not react to this class prejudice with rebellion. She reacted with calculated assimilation. The rejection bred a profound inferiority complex within her, which quickly mutated into a ruthless, lifelong ambition. If the old money elite despised her Irish roots, she would simply erase them. She executed the first stage of this deception with chilling precision. Janet completely buried her immediate ancestry. She stopped talking about her grandparents. Instead, she began circulating a new narrative. She was a direct descendant of the aristocratic Lee family of Maryland and Virginia. This was not a small white lie. The Southern Lees were American royalty. They were the family of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. To claim their bloodline was to claim an unassailable position at the very top of the American social hierarchy. It required immense audacity to look the gatekeepers of New York society in the eye and sell them a fabricated history. But Janet possessed an ironclad nerve. She repeated the lie until it became her accepted truth. To make the forgery flawless, she needed the right staging. She weaponized her father's bank accounts to buy the necessary environment. Janet enrolled at Miss Spence's school in New York. This institution was not designed for academic rigor. It was a finishing school built to train the daughters of the elite in the exact mechanics of high society. Janet used it as a laboratory. She studied the posture, the modulated accents, and the quiet arrogance of the old money girls. She learned how to move, speak, and command a room like a woman born to inherited power. Her educational record reflects her true priorities. After Miss Spence's, she attended Sweetbriar College and Barnard College. The name-dropping of these institutions looked perfect on a social resume, but archival records confirm she never bothered to graduate. Earning a degree was irrelevant. Once she had extracted the social connections and the veneer of intellectual refinement, she discarded the academics. She had a different arena in mind for her public ascent. She chose the equestrian ring. In the 1920s, competitive horseback riding was the ultimate gate-kept sport. It required massive financial investment, access to exclusive country clubs, and physical courage. You could fake a bloodline in a drawing room, but you could not fake controlling a horse over a 5-foot jump in front of a crowd. Janet threw herself into equestrian training with a brutal discipline. She became a formidable show jumper. Her writing style was described as aggressive and fearless. She did not just participate, she dominated. Janet won 3 major championships at the National Horse Show. This was a critical victory. When she sat in the saddle, executing flawless jumps while the New York elite watched from the stands, she physically embodied the aristocratic ideal. The equestrian titles provided her with an undeniable aura of legitimacy. She was no longer just the daughter of an Irish real estate developer. She was a champion rider with the poise of a Southern aristocrat. With her public image solidified, Janet moved to institutionalize her new identity. She understood that high society validated itself through historical societies and exclusive boards. Using her newly minted social connections and her father's checkbook, she secured positions on the boards of the Redwoods Library and the Newport Historical Society. Newport, Rhode Island, was the ultimate playground for the American elite. By gaining a foothold in their historical society, she embedded herself into their cultural record. But her masterpiece of social manipulation was still to come. Leveraging her fabricated Southern lineage, Janet successfully campaigned for and won the position of honorary director of the Robert E. Lee Memorial Association in Stratford, Virginia. It was the perfect con. The granddaughter of Irish Catholic immigrants from Manhattan had successfully infiltrated and been validated by the guardians of Southern aristocratic history. She had laundered her identity through a legitimate historical institution. By her early 20s, Janet Norton Lee had successfully built a fortress of lies so structurally sound that no one thought to question it. She had erased her past, rewritten her bloodline, and forced the East Coast elite to accept her on her own invented terms. She had acquired the pedigree. Now, she needed the power. By 1928, Janet Norton Lee had successfully constructed a flawless aristocratic exterior. She had the right accent, the right equestrian trophies, and the right board memberships. But in the ruthless calculus of high society, a woman's status was only provisional until it was anchored by marriage. Janet needed a husband whose surname could validate her fabricated pedigree. She needed a name that already possessed the unassailable power she had spent her youth imitating. She found her target on the manicured lawns of East Hampton. His name was John Vernou Bouvier III. To the world, he was known as Black Jack. The moniker was a tribute to his permanently deep tan, his dark, slicked-back hair, and a dangerous, magnetic charm that mirrored Hollywood icons like Clark Gable. He was a stockbroker, a fixture of the most exclusive gentlemen's clubs, and a man who wore custom-tailored suits with devastating precision. He also carried a reputation as a notorious womanizer, a fact that earned him his other nickname, the Black Orchid. To Janet, none of the red flags mattered. What mattered was the Bouvier brand. In the social ecosystem of New York, the Bouvier presented themselves as French aristocracy. They claimed direct descent from noble bloodlines, complete with a family crest and a manufactured history of European grandeur. To Janet, a woman desperate to distance herself from her Irish immigrant grandparents, a French nobleman was the ultimate prize, but their courtship was not a romance. It was a mutual con. The high society gossips of the era observed the union with cynical clarity. They summarized the marriage with a brutal, accurate verdict. She married him because his name was in the social register. He married her because her father ran a bank. She is a terror. He is a scoundrel. And in the end, they were both disillusioned. Black Jack was just as much of a fraud as Janet. The Bouviers were not French nobility. They were simply third-generation immigrants whose ancestors included cabinet makers and hardware merchants. They had accumulated some wealth, but they had aggressively exaggerated their lineage to climb the social ladder. In a spectacular twist of irony, Black Jack pursued Janet precisely because he believed her carefully constructed lie. He looked at her and saw the wealthy heiress of the old money Maryland Lees, backed by the vast, untapped fortune of a prominent New York real estate developer. They were two master illusionists, each believing they had successfully trapped a superior catch. On July 7, 1928, they walked down the aisle at St. Philomena's Catholic Church in East Hampton. It was a spectacle of wealth and privilege, a merging of two supposedly great houses. The illusion lasted exactly 1 year. In October 1929, the Wall Street crash decimated the American economy. The Great Depression set in, and the stock market collapse directly hit Black Jack's finances. The Bouvier wealth, which was heavily leveraged in the market, evaporated almost overnight. He was stripped of his financial power, and with it, the elegant facade he used to navigate the world. Financial ruin acts as an accelerant for character flaws. Without the cushion of limitless money, Black Jack's true nature took over. He was not a stoic aristocrat. He was a fragile hedonist. He self-medicated his financial failures with severe alcoholism. He gambled recklessly, bleeding out whatever capital the family had left. During this rapid decline, Janet gave birth to their two daughters, Jacqueline in 1929, just months before the crash, and Caroline Lee in 1933. The arrival of children did nothing to sober Jack. Instead, his behavior grew increasingly erratic and cruel. His most destructive weapon was his chronic infidelity. Black Jack was a serial cheater who made little effort to hide his affairs. In the rigid, appearance-obsessed world Janet inhabited, a husband's infidelity was something a wife was expected to quietly tolerate, provided it remained discreet. But Jack was sloppy. He humiliated Janet publicly. He openly pursued other women at society parties, leaving Janet to endure the pitying stares of her peers. The psychological warfare between the couple was intense. Janet, a woman whose entire existence was predicated on total control and perfect public presentation, was trapped in a house with a chaotic, unpredictable drunk. They fought violently behind closed doors. The Park Avenue apartment became a battleground of screaming matches, broken glass, and shattered pride. The breaking point arrived through the tabloids. Janet opened a newspaper to find a photograph of her husband, the father of her children, casually holding hands with another woman in public. For a woman who had spent a decade carefully managing her image, this was a lethal strike. The public humiliation was absolute. It shattered the last remaining fragments of her tolerance. This betrayal was compounded by a dark family tragedy. Black Jack's younger brother, William Bud Bouvier, lost his own battle with severe alcoholism, drinking himself to an early death. For Janet, Bud's death was a terrifying mirror. It proved that the Bouvier men lacked the discipline to survive their own demons. She looked at her husband and saw a man perfectly willing to drag his wife and daughters down with him into a vortex of scandal and poverty. Janet made a ruthless, unyielding decision. She would not drown with him. In 1936, she took Jackie and Lee, packed her bags, and formally separated from John Vernu Bouvier III. Walking away was an act of supreme grit. In the 1930s, divorce was not just a legal process. It was a social execution. For a prominent Catholic family, it was considered an unforgivable sin. The Roman Catholic Church strictly forbade it, and high society shunned divorced women as damaged goods. By seeking a divorce, Janet knew she was risking absolute social exile. She did not care. Her survival instinct overrode her fear of the establishment. She endured a brutal, highly publicized legal battle. The proceedings dragged on for years, filled with ugly accusations, financial disputes, and raw public exposure. The divorce was finally made official in 1940. The fallout from this fractured marriage was catastrophic, radiating far beyond Janet's own life. It inflicted a deep, permanent psychological scar on 11-year-old Jacqueline. Jackie had idolized her father. Despite his profound flaws, Black Jack showered his daughters with cinematic affection when he was actually around. The divorce tore Jackie's world apart. She watched her father's decline and her mother's cold fury, learning a devastating lesson about the fragility of love. It bred in Jackie a deep-seated distrust of men, a cautious guardedness that she would carry into the White House and beyond. But for Janet, the divorce of 1940 was a crucible. It burned away every trace of romantic naivety she possessed. She had entered the marriage believing in the power of a name and the illusion of aristocratic grace. She left it knowing that names could be forged, grace could be faked, and men could destroy you. She found herself in a terrifying reality. She was a 33-year-old divorced Catholic mother of two, publicly humiliated, holding a completely shattered social standing and staring down the barrel of severe financial distress. Black Jack was ruined, and the alimony she fought for was a mere fraction of what she needed to maintain the world she had built. She had survived the deception. Now she had to survive the poverty. And Janet Leigh had a pathological terror of being poor. The ink on the 1940 divorce papers had barely dried before the crushing reality of Janet's new existence set in. She had won her freedom from John Vernou Bouvier III, but that freedom came at a staggering financial cost. In the eyes of the law, she was victorious. In the ruthless ledger of New York high society, she was teetering on the edge of the abyss. When a woman of the social register fell, she did not fall into absolute destitution. She fell into something the elite considered far worse: irrelevance. The court granted Janet an alimony of $1,000 a month. To an average American family in 1940, recovering from the Great Depression, that was a small fortune. But Janet did not live in average America. She operated in a world where $1.00 barely covered the baseline maintenance of a respectable aristocratic facade. It had to pay for a prime Manhattan apartment address, bespoke clothing, private school tuitions, and the rigid social obligations required to keep her daughters in the orbit of the ruling class. For the first time in her life, Janet looked at her bank accounts and felt genuine terror. It was not a passing anxiety. It was a pathological, bone-deep fear of penury. Poverty to Janet was not just about lacking funds. It meant social erasure. It meant that all her years of carefully constructing her Maryland Leigh ancestry, her equestrian championships, and her Newport board memberships would be wiped out. She refused to become a cautionary tale, a tragic, discarded divorcee fading into the background of society parties she could no longer afford to host, but sheer willpower could not pay the bills. When the alimony checks fell short, Janet was forced to do the unthinkable. She went to work. In a move that horrified her social circle, the former society queen took a job as a floor model at a high-end department store. It was a brutal psychological downgrade. Women who had once been her guests at lavish Park Avenue dinners now watched her parade in clothing she was being paid to display. She swallowed the indignity with a hardened jaw. Every patronizing smile she received on that sales floor acted as fuel. Even with the modeling income, the math did not work. The ultimate humiliation came when she had to approach her parents for a financial bailout. James T. Leigh, the Irish real estate tycoon, whose background she had spent a decade running away from, now held her survival in his hands. Begging for an allowance from the father she viewed with such deep, complex shame was a bitter pill, yet Janet's most defining trait was her absolute refusal to break character. She enforced a regime of extreme financial discipline behind closed doors, masked by a flawless exterior. She would aggressively slash the grocery budget, essentially forcing herself to skip meals, just so she could afford to keep a live-in maid and a private tutor for Jackie and Lee. This was not maternal vanity. It was strategic conditioning. Janet understood that the moment her daughters realized they were poor, they would lose their aristocratic confidence. They had to walk, talk, and breathe as if they owned the world, because that was the only way they were going to conquer it. Jackie's elite equestrian lessons were never canceled. The tailored riding habits were always pressed. Janet starved in private so her daughters could shine in public. But Janet knew that budgeting and department store wages were temporary bandages on a fatal wound. She needed a permanent solution. She needed an impregnable financial fortress. She began hunting for her second husband with the cold, assessing eye of a corporate raider. Romance was off the table. Black Jack Bouvier had cured her of any lingering belief in charm, passion, or physical attraction. She had married for a name once. Now she was marrying strictly for capital. The target she locked onto was Hugh Dudley Auchincloss, known to his friends as Hughie. Auchincloss was the antithesis of Jack Bouvier. Where Jack was dark, dangerous, and chronically unfaithful, Hughie was quiet, predictable, and remarkably dull. He was a prominent lawyer and a former intelligence officer. More importantly, he was an heir to the staggering Standard Oil fortune. Hughie did not just have money, he had empires. He owned Marywood, a sprawling, palatial estate in McLean, Virginia, that overlooked the Potomac River. He owned Hammersmith Farm, a colossal 28-room Victorian mansion set on a 50-acre peninsula in Newport, Rhode Island. To marry Hugh Auchincloss was to merge with an institution. Jeanette moved with breathtaking speed. She deployed her refined charm, targeting a man who desired a capable, elegant wife to manage his vast estates. In June 1942, just as the United States was plunging deep into the chaos of the Second World War, Janet and Hughie were married. The wedding was entirely devoid of sentimentality. It was a rushed, pragmatic transaction. Due to wartime travel restrictions and gas rationing, Jackie and Lee could not even make it to the ceremony. Janet did not wait for them. The ink on the marriage certificate was the only thing that mattered. With a single signature, she instantly acquired absolute financial security, erasing the humiliation of the past 2 years. But almost immediately after the honeymoon, Janet was confronted with a crisis that threatened to dismantle her newly secured empire. Behind the closed doors of Marywood, Hughie made a deeply private confession. He suffered from chronic impotence. For many women in the 1940s, such a revelation might have led to an annulment or a quiet resignation to a sexless, companionate marriage. But Janet did not view this as a romantic tragedy. She viewed it as a critical vulnerability in her contract. Hugh Auchincloss was wealthy, but he also had children from previous marriages. If Janet remained childless, her connection to the Auchincloss fortune would always be secondary. She would be the well-cared-for wife, but she would never be the mother of the heirs. In the ruthless hierarchy of American dynasties, blood is the only guarantee of permanent power. She needed to physically anchor herself to the Standard Oil money. She needed children. Faced with a husband who could not conceive, Janet bypassed grief and went straight to radical problem solving. Displaying a formidable and entirely pragmatic mind, she turned to a medical procedure that was at the time highly experimental, profoundly risky, and intensely taboo: artificial insemination. The true audacity of this medical gamble becomes glaringly obvious when placed against the strict social landscape of the early 1940s. Artificial insemination using a donor was not discussed in polite society. It was medically primitive, legally ambiguous, and morally condemned by the Catholic Church, the very institution Janet was raised in. If the high society of Newport or Washington ever discovered that the Auchincloss heirs were conceived in a laboratory using an anonymous donor, the scandal would have been apocalyptic. It would have ruined Hughie's reputation, destroyed Janet's carefully rebuilt social standing, and marked the children as illegitimate in the eyes of the elite. It was a staggering gamble. But Janet's fear of losing her grip on the Auchincloss fortune was far greater than her fear of social ruin. She arranged the procedure with absolute ironclad secrecy. The mechanics of the process were kept strictly between her, Hughie, and a trusted physician. The psychological toll of undergoing such an invasive, secret procedure during an era that heavily stigmatized women's reproductive health must have been immense. But Janet never wavered. The gamble paid off perfectly. Janet successfully conceived. She gave birth to 2 children, Janet Jennings Auchincloss in 1945 and James Lee Auchincloss in 1947. The birth of these children was Janet's ultimate triumph. It was the final nail in the coffin of her financial insecurity. She was now the mother of the Auchincloss heirs. She had successfully bound her bloodline to one of the most powerful industrial fortunes in the United States. No one could ever evict her. No one could ever make her poor again. Through sheer grit, extreme pragmatism, and a willingness to break every convention of her era. Janet Leigh had pulled herself from the wreckage of a humiliating divorce and seated herself on an American throne. She had conquered poverty. Now, with a fortress of wealth surrounding her, she turned her attention fully to the two daughters she had brought with her from her past life. Jackie and Lee were about to become the subjects of the most rigorous, demanding, and psychologically grueling social experiment in the history of the American elite. With the Standard Oil fortune firmly secured and the sprawling estates of Marywood and Hammersmith Farm under her command, Janet Norton Leigh had achieved the ultimate financial victory. But for a woman whose psychology was forged in the fires of social insecurity and a humiliating divorce, victory was not a signal to rest. It was a mandate to consolidate power. She turned her intense, assessing focus onto the two daughters she had brought with her from her ruined first marriage, Jacqueline and Caroline Leigh. Janet did not view raising daughters as an act of maternal nurturing. She viewed it as a military campaign. She had survived the collapse of her own romantic illusions, and she was determined to ensure her daughters never made the same mistake. Love, in Janet's worldview, was a dangerous liability. Financial leverage was the only truth. She projected her own pathological fear of poverty onto Jackie and Lee, drilling a ruthless, pragmatic ideology into their young minds. Her core philosophy was simple but absolute. Luxury is not a preference. It is a biological necessity for survival. In the 1940s and early 1950s, the American ideal for a young woman of privilege was to attend a good college, perhaps dabble in a polite profession like publishing or art history, and eventually marry a respectable man. Janet discarded this traditional model. She had no interest in her daughters becoming career women. A career meant depending on a salary, and a salary meant vulnerability. The only acceptable path to absolute, unassailable security was a strategic marriage to extreme wealth. To achieve this, Janet designed and enforced what biographers and historians have later termed a geisha curriculum. This was not an official schooling system. It was a grueling, 24-hour domestic training program, engineered to turn Jackie and Lee into the ultimate apex predators of the debutante circuit. They were trained to attract, charm, and eventually lock down the most powerful men in America. Every element of their daily lives at the Auchincloss Estates was curated to serve this singular objective. The dining room table at Marywood was not a place for relaxed family banter. It was a testing ground. During meals, Janet frequently instituted a strict French-only rule. This was not merely to encourage bilingualism. It was an exercise in class signaling. Fluency in French was the universal language of the global aristocracy. If a young woman could effortlessly debate literature or politics in perfect Parisian French while navigating a complex, multi-course dinner, she immediately separated herself from the newly rich and aligned herself with the old-world elite. If Jackie or Lee slipped into English or mispronounced a word, Janet's reprimands were swift and cutting. Their intellectual diet was heavily monitored. Janet ensured they were thoroughly educated in classic literature, Renaissance painting, and European history. This was not to satisfy a pure love of learning. It was tactical. A high society wife needed to be an asset to her husband in public. She needed to sit next to senators, foreign dignitaries, or industrial titans at a dinner party and hold their attention effortlessly. Intellectual refinement was simply another weapon in the arsenal of seduction. Physical discipline was just as critical. And once again, Janet weaponized the equestrian ring. Jackie was put on a horse almost as soon as she could walk. To the outside observer, it looked like the standard recreational habit of the rich. Behind the scenes, it was a brutal psychological proving ground. Janet demanded excellence. She used horseback riding to forge a specific type of character in Jackie. Controlling a massive, unpredictable animal requires an iron will, physical courage, and a total masking of fear. When Jackie was thrown from a horse, Janet did not coddle her. She ordered her back into the saddle immediately, This training was designed to instill a fierce, internalized discipline. Janet wanted her daughters to learn how to fall, how to take a hit, and how to get back up without ever letting the audience see them cry. It was the exact emotional stoicism required to survive a high-profile marriage. But the most crucial lessons Janet imparted were in the dark arts of psychological manipulation. She taught her daughters how to operate within the rigid structures of the patriarchy without ever truly surrendering their own agency. She instructed them in the precise mechanics of behavior. They were taught to be perfectly measured, always elegant, always slightly aloof, and never overly eager. They learned how to listen to men with an intense, captivating focus that made the man feel like the center of the universe. It was a calculated, highly disciplined form of flattery. However, Janet's ultimate strategic rule was devastatingly practical. She warned her daughters that in the world of old money, the young men rarely controlled their own destinies. The trust funds, the estates, and the family businesses were controlled by the patriarchs and matriarchs. Therefore, a woman's primary target was never just the suitor. The target was the parents. Janet taught Jackie and Lee that if they could charm a man's mother and earn the deep respect of his father, the marriage proposal would inevitably follow. The parents were the ultimate gatekeepers of the wealth. This strategy required a chilling level of situational awareness, demanding that the girls constantly read the room and adjust their personalities to perfectly mirror the expectations of the older generation. From the outside, the Auchincloss estates looked like paradise. Jackie and Lee were widely admired as the most poised, cultured, and elegant young women in Washington and Newport. But behind the manicured hedges and the grand facades, the atmosphere was dark, volatile, and suffocating. Janet's demand for absolute perfection created a household governed by fear. She possessed a terrifying, explosive temper. When the facade of the aristocratic household cracked, even slightly, her rage was unleashed. And the primary target for this rage was her eldest daughter. Jacqueline had the great misfortune of bearing a striking physical resemblance to her father. She had Black Jack Bouvier's dark, wide-set eyes, his distinct jawline, and his athletic build. For Janet, looking at Jackie's face was a daily, unavoidable reminder of the man who had humiliated her, cheated on her, and nearly destroyed her social standing. Unable to punish Black Jack, Janet transferred her unresolved trauma and venom directly onto Jackie. She subjected her daughter to a relentless, agonizing campaign of physical criticism. Janet attacked every feature that did not align with the delicate porcelain ideal of 1950s femininity. She routinely mocked Jackie for having messy, unruly hair. She harshly criticized her for having large hands and wide feet, calling them clumsy and unfeminine. She shamed Jackie for her broad shoulders and flat chest. In Janet's calculus, these physical traits were not just minor imperfections, they were fatal flaws in the high-stakes marriage market. She made Jackie feel monstrous. This unrelenting body shaming inflicted deep psychological damage, breeding an intense self-consciousness that Jackie would battle for the rest of her life. It is the reason why, years later as First Lady, Jackie would pioneer the bouffant hairstyle to balance out her facial features, and why she frequently wore her signature white gloves, a direct habit formed to hide the hands her mother had convinced her were ugly. But the abuse was not confined to cruel words. The veneer of polite society often masked horrific domestic realities, and the Auchincloss household was no exception. Janet's pursuit of discipline frequently crossed the line into physical violence. The evidence of this brutality had actually been entered into the public record years earlier during the 1940 divorce proceedings against Jack Bouvier. During a sworn deposition, a former maid who had lived intimately with the family stepped forward to testify. Under the penalty of perjury, she stated that she had personally witnessed Janet Lee physically beat both of her young daughters. The violence was not a one-time loss of control. It was a systemic tool used to enforce submission and perfect obedience, Jackie and Lee were trapped in a beautiful, gilded prison. They were dressed in the finest clothes, educated in the most elite environments, and paraded in front of society as the ultimate symbols of American grace. But their private reality was defined by walking on eggshells around a mother who viewed them less as children and more as assets that needed to be aggressively managed and ruthlessly polished. The geisha curriculum succeeded. It forged Jackie and Lee into women of extraordinary poise, intelligence, and survival instinct. But it also taught them that their worth was inherently tied to their ability to secure and manage wealthy men. It taught them to mask their pain, hide their flaws, and treat human connection as a transaction. Janet had successfully built the perfect weapons for social conquest. Now she was ready to deploy them onto the ultimate battlefield. The 1950s had arrived, and Janet Lee was about to aim her eldest daughter directly at the rising star of the Democratic Party, a young, ambitious politician who carried a name that would soon define an era. She was about to target the Kennedys. The entrance of Jacqueline Bouvier into the social orbit of John Fitzgerald Kennedy was not an accident of fate. It was the flawless execution of a decade-long training program. By the early 1950s, Janet Lee's geisha curriculum had shaped her eldest daughter into the ultimate aristocratic asset. Jackie was multilingual, wildly intelligent, effortlessly poised, and armed with an alluring, enigmatic restraint. She was ready for the absolute highest echelons of American power. The target was identified in May 1952 at a dinner party hosted by journalist Charles Bartlett. Across the table sat John F. Kennedy, a young, charismatic, fiercely ambitious congressman from Massachusetts who was already being groomed by his father for the presidency. On paper, the Kennedys presented a fascinating psychological conflict for Janet. They possessed unimaginable wealth, largely generated by the ruthless bootlegging and Wall Street machinations of the patriarch, Joe Kennedy. They had political power, but they were also the exact thing Janet had spent her entire adult life running away from. They were Irish Catholics to the old money wasp establishment that Janet had successfully infiltrated. The Kennedys were considered loud, brash, aggressive, and decidedly new money. Joe Kennedy was notorious for his crude ambition. Yet Janet was a supreme pragmatist. She looked past the Boston Irish boisterousness and saw the sheer, undeniable velocity of JFK's political trajectory. The Kennedys did not just want to join the establishment, they were going to conquer it. Janet recognized that merging her meticulously crafted, pseudo-royal Lee bloodline with the raw political machinery of the Kennedys would create an unstoppable American dynasty. At the Bartlett dinner, Jackie deployed her training with lethal precision. While other women threw themselves at the handsome congressman, Jackie held back. She engaged him with sharp wit, displayed her deep knowledge of history, and then gracefully retreated, leaving him intrigued. She played the ultimate game of aristocratic hard to get, a technique her mother had hammered into her for years. JFK was captivated. The courtship began. But as Kennedy's political star rose, culminating in his election to the United States Senate in late 1952, the pressure to secure the marriage intensified. When JFK finally proposed, holding out a massive emerald and diamond ring, Jackie did something that nearly gave her mother a nervous breakdown. She did not say yes. Not immediately. Jackie told JFK she needed time to think, packed her bags, and left for London for an entire month to cover the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II as the inquiring camera girl for the Washington Times-Herald. Back in the United States, Janet was consumed by a state of sheer, unadulterated panic. The control she so desperately craved was slipping through her fingers. She viewed Jackie's hesitation as a reckless, catastrophic gamble. In Janet's mind, you did not make a Kennedy wait. You locked down the contract before another society girl could swoop in. During that month, Janet was a tightly wound spring of anxiety, pacing the halls of Marywood, terrified that her masterpiece of social engineering was about to throw away the ultimate prize out of a misplaced sense of independence. When Jackie returned from Europe and finally accepted the proposal, Janet did not just exhale. She immediately seized total command of the operation. The wedding was set for September 12, 1953, in Newport, Rhode Island. This was not going to be a mere marriage ceremony. It was going to be a coronation. Janet orchestrated every single detail of the wedding of the century to ensure it projected absolute, unassailable aristocratic power. She secured St. Mary's Church and prepared the sprawling grounds of the Auchincloss estate, Hammersmith Farm, for a reception of over 700 guests. The guest list was a tactical merging of the Kennedy political machine and the Newport elite. Yet, beneath the surface of the grand preparations, Janet's deeply ingrained snobbery and cruelty reared its head, most notably in the treatment of Anne Lowe. Lowe was an incredibly talented African-American fashion designer who had been hired to create Jackie's iconic wedding dress and the bridesmaids' gowns. When a flood in Lowe's studio destroyed the dresses just 10 days before the wedding, Lowe and her team worked day and night, absorbing all the costs to recreate them. When Lowe arrived at Hammersmith Farm to deliver the masterpieces, the staff told her she had to use the service entrance at the back. Lowe refused, threatening to take the dresses back to New York unless she walked through the front door. She won that standoff. But later, when the press asked Janet, who had designed the magnificent gown, Janet coldly refused to say Lowe's name, simply dismissing it as the work of a colored dressmaker. It was a stark reminder of the chilling elitism that formed the bedrock of Janet's worldview. However, the ultimate display of Janet's ruthlessness occurred on the morning of the wedding itself. The stage was set. The press was waiting. But there was a massive, unpredictable variable in the equation. Black Jack Bouvier. Jackie's biological father had been invited to walk her down the aisle. He had checked into the Viking Hotel in Newport, visibly aging, financially ruined, and emotionally volatile. For years he had been drinking heavily, his handsome features bloated by alcohol. To Black Jack, this wedding was his final moment in the spotlight, a chance to prove he still mattered. Janet knew her ex-husband better than anyone. She knew he was a ticking time bomb. She was terrified he would stumble, slur his words, or embarrass the family in front of the Kennedys and the global press. The Kennedys were already weary of Black Jack's reputation. Janet was not going to let a ruined drunk jeopardize the most important day of her family's life. On the morning of the wedding, Black Jack was reportedly heavily intoxicated in his hotel room. Some historical accounts suggest Janet went out of her way to ensure he was supplied with alcohol the night before, effectively setting a trap. Whether she engineered his drunkenness or simply capitalized on his addiction, her reaction was absolute. She barred him from the ceremony. She did not offer grace, and she did not try to sober him up. She executed his parental rights with a single, cold command. She informed Jackie that her father was unfit and would not be attending. To protect the flawless image of the dynasty, Janet ordered her current husband, Hugh Auchincloss, to step in and walk Jackie down the aisle. It was a devastating emotional blow for Jackie, who worshipped her father despite his flaws. She walked down the aisle to marry the future president of the United States, hiding immense private agony behind a perfect, practiced smile. Meanwhile, Black Jack sat alone in his hotel room, weeping, entirely erased from his daughter's triumph. Janet had neutralized the threat. The facade remained unbroken. As Jackie ascended to the ultimate stage, becoming First Lady of the United States in 1961, Janet shifted into a new role, the invisible director operating behind the throne. The White House years cemented Jackie as a global icon of grace, culture, and fashion. But that effortless perfection was heavily managed. Janet was a constant, unseen presence, advising her daughter on the brutal mechanics of public life. She consulted on Jackie's wardrobe, ensuring every Oleg Cassini suit and pillbox hat communicated exactly the right blend of modern elegance and patrician authority. But Janet's most critical role during the White House years was far darker. She served as Jackie's emotional anchor and pragmatic coach regarding the deepest trauma of the Kennedy marriage, JFK's serial, compulsive infidelity. John F. Kennedy was a chronic philanderer. His affairs were numerous, reckless, and conducted right under the roof of the White House. For Jackie, history was repeating itself with agonizing precision. She had married a man exactly like her father, charming, powerful, and utterly incapable of fidelity. The humiliation was crushing. But when Jackie turned to her mother, Janet did not offer sentimental comfort. She offered the hardened survival tactics she had forged in her own failed marriage. Janet knew the pain of a cheating husband, but she also knew the cost of a divorce. She reminded Jackie that walking away from Black Jack had plunged them into near poverty and social exile. Walking away from the President of the United States was entirely out of the question. Janet coached Jackie to detach emotionally. She taught her how to leverage her husband's guilt. Whenever JFK's affairs became too obvious or humiliating, Jackie, guided by her mother's pragmatic playbook, would demand massive concessions, usually in the form of exquisite jewelry or highly expensive art. Janet taught her daughter that if a man strips you of your dignity behind closed doors, you make him pay for it in cold, hard capital. The facade of the happy first family had to be maintained at all costs. The power was worth the pain. While Janet was managing the First Lady, she was simultaneously orchestrating an equally ambitious, though far more complicated, campaign for her second daughter. Lee had always existed in the agonizing shadow of her older sister. If Jackie was the intellectual, poised queen, Lee was the restless, intensely competitive second-in-command. Janet recognized Lee's burning desire to outshine Jackie, and she channeled it into the only avenue she respected. Marrying up, Lee's first marriage to Michael Canfield, a publishing heir, was perfectly respectable, but for a family now aligned with the Kennedys, respectable was no longer enough. The Canfield marriage lacked the sheer wattage required to compete with the White House. The marriage dissolved. In 1959, Lee set her sights on a target that would finally give her the one thing Jackie did not have, a royal title. His name was Prince Stanislaw Radziwiłł, a Polish nobleman who had fled the Soviet occupation and established himself as a wealthy real estate developer in London. He was known as Stas. There was just one massive institutional problem. Both Lee and Stas were divorced, and the Roman Catholic Church did not recognize their civil marriage. For a family deeply embedded in Catholic political power, JFK was about to become the first Catholic president. Having a sister living in an unrecognized sinful marriage was a massive political liability. Janet refused to let institutional rules block her family's ascent. She mobilized the full, terrifying weight of the Kennedy political machine and the Auchincloss wealth. In a stunning display of back-channel power brokering, the family successfully lobbied the Vatican. They secured an incredibly rare, highly controversial annulment for Lee, legally erasing her first marriage in the eyes of the church. The moment the annulment was secured, Janet fully endorsed the creation of Lee's new identity. Lee began styling herself globally as Princess Caroline Lee Radziwiłł. It was a masterclass in hypocrisy and social manipulation. The reality was that the nation of Poland had officially abolished all noble titles in 1921. Under international law, the title of Prince or Princess Radziwiłł was entirely defunct. It meant absolutely nothing. But Janet, the woman who had spent her youth faking a connection to the Maryland Lees, understood that the truth mattered far less than the performance. If you demand people call you a princess, and you have the money and the wardrobe to back it up, society will eventually bow. Janet enabled and fiercely protected Lee's fake royal title, cementing her second daughter's status as global royalty. But Janet's support for Lee's romantic endeavors was highly conditional. It existed only as long as it served the family brand. When Lee's actions threatened to cast a shadow on the Kennedy administration, Janet transformed from a supportive mother into a ruthless enforcer. The ultimate clash occurred in the early 1960s. involving one of the most powerful and dangerous men in the world. Aristotle Onassis, the Greek shipping magnate, was a billionaire, a pirate of the high seas, and a man whose reputation was steeped in scandal, ruthless business tactics, and blatant affairs. He was the exact opposite of the refined WASP image the Kennedys projected, and Lee Radziwill had fallen deeply, passionately in love with him. While still married to Prince Radziwill, Lee began a highly visible, intense affair with Onassis. She believed he was her ultimate ticket to stepping out of Jackie's shadow. Onassis showered her with unimaginable wealth, taking her on his legendary yacht, the Christina O, and treating her like an empress. Lee was ready to divorce Stas and marry the Greek billionaire. When Janet found out, she moved with the destructive force of a hurricane. Janet viewed Onassis not as a romantic partner for her daughter, but as a radioactive political liability. JFK was approaching his 1964 re-election campaign. The last thing the White House needed was the president's sister-in-law divorcing a Catholic prince to marry a scandalous, shady Greek tycoon who was actively under investigation by the U.S. Department of Justice for fraudulent shipping practices. Janet did not care about Lee's happiness. She cared about the fortress she had built around Jackie. She intervened aggressively, flying to Europe and engaging in brutal, screaming confrontations with Lee. Janet ordered her daughter to end the affair immediately. She leveraged the family's guilt, the political stakes, and her own terrifying authority to break Lee's will. Janet crushed the romance entirely. She forced Lee to return to her unhappy marriage with Prince Radziwill, prioritizing the pristine image of the Kennedy White House over the emotional survival of her second daughter. Lee complied, harboring a deep, simmering resentment that would eventually poison the family dynamics permanently. By 1963, Janet Norton Lee was at the absolute peak of her invisible power. She had engineered a first lady. She had fabricated a princess. She had successfully hidden the deep, agonizing dysfunctions of both her daughters' marriages behind a curtain of geopolitical glamour. She was the ultimate puppet master of the American aristocracy. But no amount of money, planning, or social engineering could control the trajectory of a bullet. The ultimate test of Janet's hardened character was rapidly approaching. The autumn of 1963 was about to arrive, and the meticulously constructed world she had built was about to be blown apart on the streets of Dallas. Despite orchestrating the rise of the most iconic First Lady in American history and securing a defunct royal title for her second daughter, Janet Norton Lee remained a woman without a country in the eyes of the public. She had built the ultimate American dynasty, yet the architects of the Kennedy image systematically pushed her into the shadows. The media, the political operatives, and the public all colluded to cast her in a role she despised, the cold, calculating mother-in-law. In the early 1960s, the Kennedy administration was not just a political operation. It was a highly sophisticated public relations machine. The White House, managed by sharp operatives like Pierre Salinger and funded by Joe Kennedy's vast wealth, meticulously crafted the myth of Camelot. They sold the American public a vision of youth, vigor, Harvard intellect, and touch football on the lawns of Hyannis Port. It was a brand built on the raw, energetic charm of a new generation. Janet Lee simply did not fit the brand. To the Kennedy PR machine, Janet was a relic of a bygone, elitist era. With her Newport mansions, her rigid posture, and her fabricated old-money aristocratic air, she represented the exact kind of exclusionary WASP establishment that the Kennedys were trying to prove they had moved past. Consequently, the Kennedy machine made a deliberate, calculated decision to minimize her public presence. The press followed suit, treating Janet with a mixture of suspicion and quiet contempt. They rarely interviewed her. When they did write about her, they leaned heavily into the wicked stepmother trope. Society columns painted her as a ruthless, grasping social climber who had sold her daughters to the highest bidders. They described her as humorless, demanding, and utterly devoid of maternal warmth. But this media caricature was a distortion built on class resentment and political branding. Those inside the closed doors of the White House saw a very different reality. Letitia Baldrige, Jackie's formidable White House social secretary, and a woman who suffered no fools, aggressively pushed back against this narrative. Baldrige, who dealt with the most powerful egos in Washington daily, noted that Janet was entirely misunderstood by the press. Away from the cameras, Janet was fiercely loyal, sharply intelligent, and deeply protective of her inner circle. She did not demand the spotlight. She was content to manage the logistics, run the households, and serve as the invisible scaffolding that kept Jackie's flawless public image from collapsing. The true extent of the media's bias, and the Kennedy family's willingness to exploit it, became glaringly obvious during a highly publicized family event. When Lee Radziwill graduated from Concord Academy, the entire clan gathered for the celebration. Press photographers swarmed the campus, eager to capture the glamorous Kennedys mingling with the East Coast elite. Janet, as the mother of the graduate, naturally posed in the family photographs. But when the newspapers hit the stands the next morning, Janet experienced the ultimate psychological erasure. Newspaper editors had literally taken scissors to the negatives. They cropped Janet completely out of the frame. The published photos focused entirely on John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and the glamorous daughters, under headlines championing the Kennedy women. They completely ignored the fact that neither Jackie nor Lee actually possessed Kennedy blood. For a woman who had spent her entire adult life fighting for social visibility, being literally cut out of her own family's history was a profound insult. The dynasty she had engineered was actively erasing her. But Janet, disciplined by years of swallowing her pride to maintain a facade, did not complain publicly. She accepted her role in the shadows, knowing that true power did not require a newspaper headline. She remained in the background, anchored at her estates, watching her daughters rule the world. Until the world suddenly ended. By the autumn of 1963, the glittering facade of Camelot was beginning to crack under the weight of private grief. In August, Jackie gave birth prematurely to a son, Patrick Bouvier Kennedy. The infant survived for only 2 days before dying of a respiratory condition. The loss devastated Jackie, pushing her into a deep clinical depression. Jeanette watched her daughter spiral with grim familiarity. She knew the danger of letting grief consume you. When Jackie accepted an invitation from Aristotle Onassis to recover on his luxury yacht, the Christina O. Janet was reportedly furious. She had already fought a brutal war to keep Lee away from the scandalous Greek billionaire, and now he was circling her eldest daughter. But Jackie, First Lady of the United States, was beyond her mother's direct control. Janet could only wait in Washington, managing the Auchincloss estates and keeping a watchful eye on her grandchildren, Caroline and John Jr. Then came November 22nd, 1963. The morning began with mundane, elite routine. Janet was at the Chevy Chase Club in Washington, D.C., playing a round of golf. She was 55 years old, wealthy, secure, and entirely unaware that the axis of American history was about to snap. As she walked the manicured greens, a club employee rushed out to the course. The details were fragmented, chaotic, and terrifying. The president had been shot in Dallas. The severity of the wounds was unknown. The status of the First Lady was unconfirmed. In that split second, the aristocratic facade Janet had spent 50 years perfecting was completely obliterated. She did not faint. She did not succumb to hysterics. The ruthless, pragmatic survival instincts that had pulled her through a humiliating public divorce and a desperate financial crisis took absolute command. She dropped her golf clubs, rushed back to the clubhouse, and immediately contacted her husband, Hugh Auchincloss. The political machinery of Washington was in absolute chaos, but Janet's focus was singular. She needed to get to Jackie. When the official confirmation of the president's death came through, Janet and Hugh sped to Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland. This was where Air Force One would bring the president's body, and more importantly, where it would bring her daughter. The scene at Bethesda was a nightmare of flashing lights, military personnel, and weeping political aides. The country was in shock, terrified of a larger conspiracy or a Soviet attack. But Janet did not care about the geopolitical implications. She was operating purely as a mother moving into a war zone to extract her child. When Jackie finally arrived at the hospital, the sight would have broken almost anyone. The First Lady walked in wearing her iconic pink Chanel suit, now heavily stained and caked with her husband's blood and brain matter. Aides had begged her to change clothes on the flight back from Dallas, but Jackie had refused, famously stating, "Let them see what they have done." When Janet saw her daughter, covered in the gore of an assassination, she did not offer empty platitudes. She understood instantly what Jackie was doing. Jackie was weaponizing the trauma, turning her blood-stained suit into a historical indictment. Janet, who had spent decades teaching her daughter how to control a narrative and manipulate an audience, recognized the grim brilliance of the move. She did not try to force Jackie to change. She stood by her, a silent, unyielding pillar of strength in a hospital room filled with shattered men. In the darkest weekend in American history, Janet practically moved into the White House family quarters. The Kennedy political operatives immediately took control of the state funeral, organizing the military processions and the global broadcasts. But upstairs, in the private residence, the reality was entirely different. The White House was a tomb, aides whispered. The staff wept in the hallways. Jackie was operating on pure adrenaline and shock, meticulously planning a funeral based on Abraham Lincoln's ceremonies, refusing to sleep or eat. Someone had to anchor the family to reality. Someone had to manage the devastating collateral damage. That task fell entirely to Janet Leigh. The most agonizing responsibility was the children. Caroline was 5 years old. John Jr. was just days away from turning 3. On the morning of November 23, they woke up in a house that felt fundamentally altered. Their beloved nanny, Maud Shaw, was the one who broke the actual news to Caroline, telling her that her father had gone to look after Patrick in heaven. But it was Janet who provided the physical and emotional containment. The woman who had ruthlessly mocked Jackie's appearance, who had demanded perfect French at the dinner table, and who had enforced the brutal geisha curriculum, completely stripped away her authoritarian armor. When the children cried, she did not demand stoicism. When the chaos of the funeral preparations threatened to overwhelm the private quarters, she acted as a human shield, keeping the politicians and the press away from the family rooms. She held Caroline and John Jr., rocking them, feeding them, and providing the only sense of mundane normalcy left in their shattered world. For 3 days, the American public watched Jacqueline Kennedy deliver the greatest performance of grace under unimaginable pressure that the nation had ever seen. She walked behind the horse-drawn caisson. She stood perfectly straight beneath the black veil. She commanded her young son to salute his father's casket. She gave the country the closure it desperately needed. But Jackie could only maintain that flawless, iron-willed exterior for the cameras because she knew her mother was holding the line behind closed doors. When the cameras stopped rolling, when the foreign dignitaries left, and when Jackie returned to the empty White House quarters, she collapsed, and Janet was there to catch her. In the crucible of the assassination, the media's caricature of the cold, social-climbing stepmother was burned away. Janet Norton Leigh proved that beneath the calculated marriages and the forged aristocratic pedigree, she possessed a spine of absolute steel. When Camelot fell, she did not run. She stepped into the wreckage, picked up the pieces of her broken family, and carried them through the fire. Yet, as the 1960s bled into the 1970s, the trauma of Dallas would exact a heavy toll. The family had survived the assassination, but the psychological aftermath would fracture them in ways no one could predict. Janet's final years were approaching, and the control she had wielded with such terrifying precision was about to be violently torn from her grasp. The trauma of Dallas in 1963 had forced Janet Norton Lee to drop her aristocratic armor and act as the ultimate emotional shield for her shattered family. For a brief, agonizing period, the world saw the iron will of the woman behind the Kennedy myth. But as the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, the American landscape fundamentally shifted. The pristine, highly controlled image of Camelot faded, replaced by an era of cultural rebellion, political cynicism, and a new generation that actively despised the rigid social hierarchies Janet had spent her life worshipping. The East Coast establishment was losing its grip, and inside the sprawling walls of the Auchincloss estates, Janet was losing hers. By the mid-1970s, the family dynamic had irrevocably changed. Jacqueline Kennedy had shocked the world, and her mother, by marrying Aristotle Onassis in 1968. It was a move that defied Janet's earlier interference in Lee's romance with the Greek billionaire, but Jackie was now operating on a level of global power that rendered her mother's objections irrelevant. Jackie had secured her own financial empire. Lee Radziwill, meanwhile, was drifting through European high society, struggling to find an identity outside the shadows of her sister and her mother. Janet's primary domain, her marriage to Hugh Dudley Auchincloss, was also coming to an end. Hughie's health had been steadily declining for years. The massive Standard Oil fortune that had provided Janet with her impregnable financial fortress could not buy him more time. In November 1976, Hughie passed away. At 69 years old, Janet was a widow. For the first time since the desperate, impoverished days following her 1940 divorce from Blackjack Bouvier, she was untethered from a husband. But this time, she was not a terrified, broke social outcast. She was a deeply wealthy, incredibly powerful matriarch. She had secured the Auchincloss inheritance. She had successfully guided her daughters into global prominence. Her life's work, the great social climb, the geisha curriculum, the relentless management of the family brand, was complete. It was at this precise moment of total security that Janet made the most surprising and ultimately devastating decision of her life. Within the same month of Hughie's death, she remarried. The speed of the marriage shocked high society. It defied all conventions of mourning and aristocratic decorum. But the choice of the groom was even more revealing. His name was Bingham Willing Booch Morris. Morris was not a titan of industry. He did not possess a political dynasty. He was an investment banker, a familiar face in the Newport social circuit, and most importantly, a childhood friend of Janet's. To understand this marriage, one must look at the psychological exhaustion of Janet Lee. Her first marriage to Black Jack was a mutual con built on a desperate need for a pedigree. Her second marriage to Hughie was a cold, calculated corporate merger designed to secure absolute financial safety. For 50 years, Janet had treated marriage as a battlefield where she had to remain constantly vigilant, managing her image, her husband's flaws, and her daughter's futures. She was tired. Bingham Morris represented something she had never allowed herself to experience: safety without strategy. Because they had known each other since youth, Morris knew the truth about her origins. She did not have to pretend to be a descendant of the Maryland Lees around him. She did not have to maintain the flawless, icy posture of the society queen. For the first time in her existence, she lowered her defenses. She married for companionship, seeking a quiet, comfortable twilight to a life defined by ruthless ambition. It was a fatal miscalculation. The woman who had spent decades manipulating powerful men had failed to see the danger in a seemingly harmless old friend. Behind the heavy, closed doors of their Newport home, Bingham Morris revealed a deeply cruel and toxic nature. The marriage rapidly deteriorated into a nightmare of mistreatment. Morris engaged in severe elder abuse, subjecting Janet to systematic psychological cruelty and physical hostility. The tragedy of this situation was profound. Janet Lee had once possessed a temper so terrifying that she could dictate the behavior of senators and billionaires. She had commanded estates and ruthlessly shaped the lives of two of the most famous women in the world. Now stripped of her fierce independence by age and a misplaced trust, she was trapped as a victim in her own home. The power dynamic had entirely inverted. She was isolated, abused, and too proud to admit to her high society peers that her final, sentimental choice in a husband was destroying her. But Janet's daughters were no longer the terrified children of the Marywood dining room table. They were women of immense resources and influence. When the rumors of Morris's behavior finally reached Jacqueline, the response was swift and absolute. Jackie had spent a lifetime learning how to wield power from her mother. Now she used those exact tactics to save her. Jackie bypassed polite society interventions. She mobilized her legal teams, her financial resources, and her sheer terrifying authority to extract Janet from the hostile environment. In 1981, Jackie forced a formal separation, legally prying Bingham Morris away from her mother. Jackie became the protector. Stepping into the role of the matriarch, Jeanette was physically safe. But the mistreatment had accelerated a far more insidious enemy. By the early 1980s, the brilliant, calculating mind that had engineered the Camelot dynasty began to fail. Janet was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. To witness the onset of Alzheimer's is always a tragedy, but for a woman like Janet Leigh, it was a specifically tailored psychological horror. Her entire identity, her entire survival, was predicated on absolute control. She had controlled her history, her image, her daughters, and her environment. She relied on a razor-sharp memory to navigate the complex social webs of the elite, remembering every slight, every alliance, and every unwritten rule of the East Coast establishment. As the disease ravaged her brain, it systematically dismantled her defenses. The aristocratic facade she had spent 70 years building began to crumble. She forgot the French vocabulary she had once forced her daughters to speak. She lost the carefully modulated posture. The meticulously constructed identity of the society queen dissolved, leaving behind a terrified, confused elderly woman. Yet, Alzheimer's is a disease of agonizing fluctuations. There are windows of startling lucidity, moments where the fog parts and the patient is painfully aware of their own decline and the unresolved debts of their past. In one of these clear windows, Janet confronted the greatest failure of her life, the emotional destruction of her second daughter, Leigh. Throughout their childhoods, Janet had been ruthlessly transparent in her favoritism. She had focused the brunt of her ambition and her cruelty on Jackie, molding her into a masterpiece. Leigh had been treated as an afterthought, a backup asset. Janet had actively sabotaged Leigh's one chance at independent global power when she forced her to end the affair with Aristotle Onassis, only to watch silently as Jackie married Onassis a few years later. The resentment Leigh harbored toward her mother and her sister was toxic and deep-rooted. Knowing her mind was permanently fading, Janet attempted to balance the scales. But true to the ideology that had governed her entire life, she did not attempt to fix an emotional problem with a heartfelt apology. She attempted to fix it with capital. Janet secretly arranged a wire transfer of $750, directly to Leigh Radziwill. In the late 1980s, $750,000 was a massive sum. It was an estate-altering amount of money. In Janet's transactional worldview, this was the ultimate expression of maternal love and regret. It was guilt money, a silent admission that she had failed her youngest daughter, but the transaction failed to achieve its emotional objective. You cannot buy back a childhood. You cannot write a check to erase decades of neglect and psychological manipulation. Leigh accepted the money, but she did not accept the apology. The cash transfer only served to highlight the fundamental dysfunction of the family. They only knew how to communicate through leverage and wealth. As the Alzheimer's plunged Janet into permanent darkness, her illness became the final brutal test of the geisha curriculum she had instilled in her daughters. The results were starkly contrasted. Leigh Radziwill, clutching her $750,000 apology, completely withdrew. She refused to participate in the grueling, daily reality of caring for a mother with severe dementia. When pressed by family members, Lee offered a defense that perfectly encapsulated the emotional detachment her mother had taught her. She claimed she was simply too emotionally fragile to handle the stress of the illness. She stayed in her glamorous circles in Europe and New York, abandoning her mother to the care of nurses and staff. Jacqueline, however, stepped into the fire. The irony was profound. Jackie had been the primary victim of Janet's rage. She was the one who had been beaten, mocked for her appearance, and treated as a pawn in Janet's social climbing. She had every psychological justification to walk away. But Jackie possessed an iron core of duty, a trait inadvertently forged by her mother's relentless discipline. Despite her status as one of the most famous and photographed women on earth, Jackie quietly took over the management of Janet's life. She visited her mother constantly. She sat in the quiet rooms of the Newport estate, holding the hands of the woman who had once criticized them as ugly and masculine. She dealt with the heartbreaking reality of a mother who frequently no longer recognized her. Lee's refusal to help care for Janet was the final unforgivable betrayal in Jackie's eyes. The sisters had maintained a tense, competitive relationship for decades, but the abandonment of their dying mother severed the bond completely. Jackie froze Lee out. The silence between them became permanent, a Cold War that would last until the end of their lives. On July 22, 1989, at the age of 81, Janet Norton Lee Auchincloss Morris passed away. The funeral was held in Newport, the epicenter of the aristocratic world Janet had spent her life conquering. The pews of Trinity Church were filled with the remnants of the East Coast elite, political power brokers, and the extended Kennedy and Auchincloss clans. It was a solemn, highly orchestrated event, exactly the kind of flawless public performance Janet would have demanded. But the most defining moment of the day did not occur during the eulogies. It occurred in the immediate aftermath, away from the cameras, in a scene that cemented the true legacy of the Bouvier women. Bingham Morris, the estranged, abusive third husband, had the audacity to attend the funeral. For years, he had lived comfortably on the fringes of the family's wealth, largely ignored after the 1981 separation. But his presence at the burial of the woman he had mistreated was an insult Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis was not going to tolerate. Jackie did not wait for a private moment behind closed doors. She did not delegate the task to a lawyer or a male relative. She approached Morris directly in front of the gathered mourners. The interaction was brief, precise, and entirely devoid of emotion. Jackie did not raise her voice. She did not display grief. Looking directly at the man who had tormented her mother, she delivered a set of absolute commands. She demanded that he immediately surrender all of Janet's personal property, jewelry, and documents. Then, her voice dropping to a register of pure, freezing authority, she issued the final eviction. She informed Morris that he was no longer welcome on the grounds of Hammersmith Farm or any Auchincloss property. She gave him a deadline. He was to pack his bags and be completely gone from the estate before the sun sets today. Morris, faced with the terrifying, unblinking focus of a woman who had stared down heads of state and survived the darkest tragedies of the American century, crumbled. He left. He was never seen in the family's orbit again. In that single, ruthless act of vengeance, the ghost of Janet Lee manifested perfectly in her eldest daughter. Jackie had not just inherited her mother's elegance and her cheekbones. She had inherited her mother's capacity for cold, calculated violence when the family perimeter was breached. She proved that beneath the soft voice, the Chanel suits, and the literary refinement, she was a warlord. She had absorbed the hardest lesson her mother had ever taught. When threatened, you do not negotiate, and you do not cry. You annihilate the threat. To look back at the life of Janet Norton Lee is to look at the secret blueprint of American royalty. History, driven by a media obsessed with youth and male political power, has largely attempted to erase her. Biographies of the Kennedys often relegate her to a footnote, a difficult mother-in-law who occasionally hosted garden parties at her Newport estate. This erasure is a profound historical error. Without Janet Leigh, there is no Jacqueline Kennedy. Without Jacqueline Kennedy, there is no myth of Camelot. Janet was the architect who designed the cultural iconography of the 1960s. The Kennedys possessed the raw political ambition and the immense, unrefined wealth, but they lacked the essential ingredient required to transition from politicians to legends. They lacked class. Janet Leigh, a woman who had literally invented her own aristocratic class out of thin air to escape her Irish Catholic roots, provided that exact ingredient. She engineered Jackie into the ultimate weapon of cultural diplomacy. Every flawless state dinner, every carefully curated historical restoration of the White House, every perfectly timed deployment of French literature or high fashion, that was Janet Leigh's geisha curriculum playing out on the global stage. Her life exposes the central hypocrisy of the American elite. We are conditioned to believe that aristocratic grace is a matter of birthright, an innate quality passed down through pure bloodlines. Janet proved that it is all theater. She proved that grace can be manufactured, that pedigree can be forged, and that the gates of high society can be breached if you are willing to be ruthless enough. She beat the establishment at their own game by outperforming them. But her legacy is deeply complicated by the immense human cost of her ambition. The psychological damage she inflicted on her daughters was permanent. She taught them to equate love with financial leverage. She raised them in an environment where vulnerability was punished and physical appearance was ruthlessly critiqued. She pitted them against each other in a desperate competition for her approval, a competition that ultimately destroyed their sisterhood. The glamour of the Bouvier women was built on a foundation of profound private trauma. Janet Norton Leigh lived a life defined by an absolute refusal to be a victim. From the ashes of a humiliating divorce in 1940, staring into the terrifying prospect of poverty, she forged a personality of pure titanium. She was not a warm mother. She was not a kind woman. But kindness does not build dynasties. She treated the world as a hostile environment that had to be conquered and controlled. She used every tool at her disposal: deception, wealth, psychological warfare, and her own daughters to construct an impenetrable fortress against the vulnerability she feared most. When the history of the 20th century American elite is truly understood, Janet Leigh will not be remembered as a mere stepping stone in the Kennedy saga. She will be recognized as the mastermind who operated in the shadows. She was the brutal, brilliant director of the play. She demanded perfection, she punished weakness, and she left behind a legacy that proves the most enduring, unshakable crowns are always forged in the fires of private pain. She died knowing that the dynasty she built would outlive them all. She had won, and the price of that victory was exacted perfectly and ruthlessly on the souls of everyone she touched.